The trial of Dayton Leroy Rogers in the death of Jennifer Lisa Smith began in Oregon City. But this would not be the only trial that Rogers would face before the end of the decade. This was only the beginning. There was no doubt that Dayton Leroy Rogers had stabbed Jennifer Smith to death. There were too many witnesses. Knowing they could never find him innocent of this act, Rogers' defense tried to flip the narrative and claim that Smith had tried to rob him at knife point. The story was that Smith noted some $200 were in Rogers' wallet, and when they stopped behind the Denny's, she pulled a knife from his glove box and put it to his throat, demanding the money. A struggle ensued, leading the two to fall from the truck, at which time Rogers stabbed Smith to death in self-defense. This defense was full of holes. Namely, how would Smith know a knife would automatically be in Rogers' glove box? Smith had been tied up tight, making it unlikely she could have attacked him in the first place. Furthermore, her stab wounds were clearly torture cuts, not cuts from one defending himself. In telling his own self-defense story of events, Rogers would openly admit to fleeing the scene and going back to his shop and getting drunk afterwards. The question then is, why did he not call the police, either to report an attack on himself or to report the body of the woman he'd just stabbed? He survives this near-death experience and then just goes back to his shop and starts drinking? This defense never stood a chance. Several other women who'd been picked up by Rogers in the past verified his aggressive ways as well as his tendency to pull a knife on them. Jennifer Smith was clearly another victim in this long line of Portland prostitutes that had been attacked by this so-called gambler. On February 20th, 1988, after 13 hours of deliberation, the jury in this case returned a guilty verdict of aggravated murder against Dayton Leroy Rogers. To the surprise of many, in the penalty phase, the jury would sentence Rogers to life in prison when many expected him to receive a death sentence. Yes, this man was being put away, but with only a life sentence, who knew when he might be able to manage another parole? But this was only the beginning of Rogers' troubles, as it was inevitable that he would be indicted for the victims found in the Molalla Forest. Finally, come May 1988, the indictment on 6 other murder cases came down against Rogers. With one of the 7 victims still unidentified, she was not included in this indictment. But long before a trial, investigators needed to go beyond simply suspicions to connect Rogers to these 6 other victims. The stories of several other prostitutes were invaluable in this case. They all noted that Rogers would mix drinks with little bottles of vodka and OJ, like those types of containers that were left scattered all over the forest. Furthermore, there were numerous tied-up items in the forest there, like pantyhose, rope, and shoelaces. Rogers liked to tie women up, and he had used shoelaces specifically on Jennifer Smith. What was of the most evidentiary value was the revelation that the knife that was found in the forest was the exact same type of knife that Rogers had dropped at the Smith murder scene. What are the odds? The search of Rogers' truck after his arrest revealed several bloodstains in the vehicle, some of which did not belong to Rogers or Smith. Rogers' wife, Shelley, stated neither she nor her kids had ever bled in that truck. Clearly, these bloodstains had come from other victims that he'd attacked. And if his attacks led to murder in one case, who's to say he hadn't killed more? It would come out that Rogers' father-in-law, Roy Miller, had become suspicious of the wood stove at his repair shop. When Miller went through the stove, he found remains of items such as shoes and jewelry. It had been theorized that after Rogers returned to his shop after the Smith murder, that he'd burned evidence from that crime in his stove. Maybe he'd burned the evidence of other crimes. Rogers' wife, Shelley, would also ultimately tell investigators that she found a bag full of women's jewelry that was stashed in her husband's truck. When she confronted him with this, he told her that he found it in the trash. A likely story. This was all damaging, but none of it put Rogers in this random part of the wilderness, several miles from his home, several miles from where he worked, and several miles from where he picked up prostitutes. Then, a bombshell. Paul Samarin, a friend of Rogers, contacted authorities after hearing about where these bodies had been found. He would state that Rogers had taken him to that exact area in the past to go fishing. He said it was one of his favorite spots to go to. This would only be bolstered by the numerous accounts of women whom Rogers had picked up. Some were taken to the very gravel road that led to the bodies, and they immediately recognized it as the same spot Rogers had taken them in the past. Possibly the most significant account given to suggest a tie between Rogers and the location where these 7 Molalla Forest victims were found was a woman named Heather Brown. In the midst of when these other women were disappearing, July 1987, Brown was picked up by Rogers and driven into the forest. On a logging road, Rogers made his intentions known. Upon seeing an approaching logging truck, Brown leaped from Rogers' truck, possibly barely escaping with her life. All this was made known at trial, which began in March 1989. Once again, Rogers' defense had little to go on, so they did their best to attack the credibility of the many prostitutes that had come forward. They also brought on a psychologist who called Rogers insane, while also stating that he did not pose a further threat as he was only a danger to women and he was already sentenced to life in prison with only men. It was reaching and pathetic logic, pushed out of clear desperation, and thank God it was not effective. Even a near mistrial after a man yelled to jurors to hang him in the hallway of the courthouse did not stop justice. Dayton Leroy Rogers would be found guilty, once again, convicted in only a few hours. In June 1989, this jury, unlike the prior one, would sentence him to death. Rogers was finally on his way to death row. One particular juror, a Lynette Keening, when leaving the courthouse after the sentencing, was met by a middle-aged woman on the street there who simply said, "God bless you," before moving on. Keeney didn't realize it at the time, but this woman who had spoken to her was Irene James, the mother of Maureen Hodges, one of the victims found in the Molalla Forest. In the prevailing more than 30 years, it has been a back-and-forth experience for Dayton Leroy Rogers. After his death sentence was upheld in 1990, the same sentence was reversed by the Oregon State Supreme Court in 1992. In May 1994, he went back before another jury and was sentenced to death again. In May 2000, the state Supreme Court reversed this sentence again, and in 2006, he went before a third jury. And despite his claims of being a changed man, he was resentenced to death. In 2012, his sentence came under review, and the state Supreme Court vacated the sentence due to mistakes made by the judge. And finally, in November 2015, for the fourth time, he would go before a jury and be sentenced back to death row, even in a contemporary era where recent governors have put a moratorium on executions. I doubt Rogers will ever come close to being set free, but it's looking more and more like he'll also never be executed. However, in his fourth sentencing in 2015, there was one change: Rogers' admittance to killing an eighth victim, the one previously unidentified Molalla Forest victim. In what was of substantially greater significance than the back and forth convictions and reversals in Rogers' case is what happened in 2013. This last unidentified victim would finally be identified as Tanya Johnston, who was 18 at the time of her disappearance. She'd reportedly been missing since April of 1987, but little is known as to how she ended up in Rogers' web. While being from Eugene, she ended up in Portland, where her vehicle was later found, abandoned. Whatever the circumstances were, the wrong man came along, and Tanya Johnson, unfortunately, became another of his many victims. One final note on these many victims of Dayton Leroy Rogers, maybe excluding Tanya Johnston, mostly because we just don't know a whole lot about the circumstances that led her to going to Portland and the circumstances surrounding how she died. It's easy to look at these victims and say, oh, well, they were prostitutes, so they put themselves out there to have something horrible like this happen to them. And you can have whatever perspective you choose about the lives that these women were living, the choices that they'd made in life. That's your cross to bear. But I noticed, reading all of these newspaper article after newspaper article, these articles that were from that time while these events were happening and transpiring, and even as these women were being discovered on this hillside, and one by one their remains were being removed, and it was found that they died in these horrendous and painful ways. And local press spent about as much time talking about little infractions that they got into as they did talking about the tragedy of what happened to these women, these horrible things that they experienced that no human being should experience, regardless of their life choices, regardless of their profession that they pursue. And, what relevance does a shoplifting charge, in earlier 1987 bear on this case? Nothing. What does getting busted for a moving violation or for this and that? The newspaper spent so much time talking about these, criminal charges that, pretty much every victim that Rogers abducted, there was some, charge that one of these women had put up against them, and the newspapers made sure to publish those, even when they had absolutely no bearing on what happened. The fact that so-and-so shoplifted or so-and-so got a trespassing violation had absolutely no bearing whatsoever on the circumstances that surrounded these women ending up in the presence of Dayton Leroy Rogers. But that is what the perception was, and that was what sold papers was. They made sure to downplay and degrade the lives of these women and make it like they were all just these horrible tragedies and like their lives almost ended in a way that should have been expected, which really nullifies who they were, and it blames them as the victims, and in some ways gives the perpetrator a pass, which is totally unacceptable. I don't care what your perspectives are on anything involving this case, but these were human beings. Many of them were doing what they were doing to get by, to survive. Some of them wanted to do it, some of them didn't. But these were people. These weren't hookers. They weren't whores. They weren't wastes of life. They were people born the same way you and I are. They were more than meets the eye in terms of probably how each and every one of them was perceived by the general public.
Oh shit, okay.
I'd go around right on this side of Shady Dale.
Okay, well, we'll see. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. And this here is Molalla Forest Road. This is the road that Rogers would have inevitably had to come down. It's like the only way to get here. He would have been coming from this direction. Most likely, coming from Portland, he probably either would have gone down 205 and got on Highway 213 to Molalla to get out here, or he may have just stayed on Highway 99 if he was picking up people on Union and go that way all the way into Canby and then cut through Canby to Molalla to get out here. But he would have been coming from that direction and pulled off onto the, again, what was kind of a logging road to go up into the forest here. So this is, back in 1987, it was kind of a logging road that came off Molalla Forest Road, wrapped up here, and then it kind of wrapped up back this way before ending, and now this is a trailhead that connects with other trails. And I believe this road would have been called like Molalla Forest Road 75 or MF 75 is what I saw it described as. And by all accounts, this is where Dayton Leroy Rogers would bring, even before he was known to start killing, he brought women up here. One woman that survived his, attacks, they brought her out here to see if she could identify this as the spot that he brought her to. And they came in at the entryway down the hill, and she immediately recognized this as a spot that he took her. So I'm not 100% certain where the bodies were buried. I know this road wraps around and kind of would dead end up there. At least that's how it's been shown on maps. So it could have been anywhere along this stretch where he deposited the bodies, because I think he drove these women out here, attacked them, got what he wanted out of them, and then, took their bodies and deposited them, just a little ways off the road, and that's probably part of the reason why they were found. And you can, aside from the Molalla River down there that you can hear rushing, it's really quiet up here. It's really eerie. Even just driving down the road here. Now, of course, I'm a city kid, but even just driving down the kind of winding Molalla Forest Road, it was very, very, it was just an eeriness about it. And I made the comment, like, if some random guy picked me up, I would not want to come out here. Obviously, these women were sex workers and they were doing their job. And a lot of these women had been with Dayton Leroy Rogers before, and they knew that he, liked it weird, but, they survived prior experiences with them. A lot of these women had actually been with him before. So it's strange. It's almost like you could almost in that time trust him more than a lot of other people. You could almost trust him more because you'd been with him before and made through it okay. You could almost think it was safer to get in Dayton Leroy Rogers' truck, or Steve as he often went by. That would almost be deemed safer than picking up a random guy that you never met before, whose sexual appetite you don't know their motives, you don't know their background, you don't have a history with them that you've made it through. So even though some women that were working the streets in Portland, some of them would tell others, don't get in Steve's truck. And some would still do it, especially if they'd been with him in the past. So this is the way that Everett Banyard, who came up here to hunt, we came in taking the same route that he came in. And he pulled in, drove his vehicle up this road, and eventually, parked somewhere along the way and got out to go hunting. And he noticed this really bad odor. And he noticed there were places on the ground where ferns like this had been matted down, like something had been put on top of them. And as he walked around, as the story goes, he pulled back some ferns and discovered the body of a woman that would ultimately be identified as Riatha Giles. And he immediately fled the scene, going back down the road this way, and real shaken up obviously by the experience, and contacted authorities. And they came up there and started searching, figuring there's probably more victims up here. I mean, this is not as much, because obviously people do kind of come up here to hike and explore, but this is still very rural. We're like, 10 miles outside of Molalla, and it's very rural out here. It's very redneck. Not to be judgmental, but yeah, it's very out in the middle of nowhere. So I could totally see someone, especially back in the 80s, killing people and depositing their bodies out here. And it wouldn't surprise me if other people have used this area, or at least this general forest, as like a body dumping ground. It would not surprise me in the least. It wouldn't surprise me if somewhere, anywhere off, even maybe a couple miles or so, that there could be, the bodies of people that were left behind here after being murdered or dying in suspicious ways. I never thought I'd come out here. I never thought I'd figure out where this was. I knew, like, oh, he was called the Molalla, Forest killer, but I didn't know we'd actually figure out the general area where it all happened. I'd say my blood is running a little bit cold, but it's also just really cold in general out here, so that might be part of it. So what was really interesting is, while we were out there and in the vicinity of this, horrible crime, and where all of these victims were just discarded like trash, pretty much. So, the whole reason these people were found was a guy who was going up that road and into the forest there. He was there to go hunting. And I didn't take video of it because I didn't want to, piss the wrong person off or anything, but it was really interesting. There was nobody else out there, except there had to be somebody, because when we pulled in, there was one other van parked there. So we knew somebody had to be around there, but we didn't see anybody. And as I took my very last shot, I saw a guy approaching from the trail that we'd walked down. And as I got into the van, we all noticed that this guy was carrying a rifle. So initially, because we're kind of in redneck territory, we all kind of tensed up like, oh God, this guy has a gun. And then, I remembered the fact that this is a prominent area for people to go hunting, and you know, he smiled at us. He was chill. He was just a guy out hunting. So we calmed down pretty quickly after that. But I thought it was so interesting, even though it is an area that's prominent for hunters to go to. In that one brief period that we were there, that when we left, there would happen to also be a hunter there, just like there was back in August of 1987, who found all those bodies up there. So it was a little, it freaked us for a quick second, and then I started reflecting. I was like, that's really, just the timing was just really interesting and all that.